on this committee. It is all what makes you just wildly unqualified. One of the things you have said is that anti-white discrimination is the most pervasive and politically salient form of racism today. So do you continue to believe that anti-white discrimination is more salient than a year ago? A year ago, were white Americans the most discriminated against group in the United States? You said it. So
yeah.
Senator,
no, certainly this is my belief. I'm not running away from that. I think that while, of course, all races in different contexts can be subject to really severe discrimination, that when we look at our legal structures, white Americans are often very disfavored in overt ways. We're seeing this in the small business.
Tell me what is being erased. I mean, give me some examples of what you believe are being erased about white identity. What is white identity to you?
Tell me what white identity is. Senator Chris Murphy repeatedly pressed Jeremy Carl to explain his claims about white culture and discrimination. And when the nominee struggled to give a clear answer, Murphy delivered a brutal conclusion about his fitness for the job.
Mr. Carl, I think it's just heartbreaking that you have been nominated for this position and that you've reached a panel before the United States Senate. But I do want to give you a chance to go a little bit deeper in your explanations of your personal beliefs. They are directly relevant to your fitness to serve. You already have had some of your statements read to you, but I'd like you to respond to at least a few of them. One of the things you have said is that anti-white discrimination is the most pervasive and politically salient form of racism today. So do you continue to believe that anti-white discrimination is more salient than the discrimination faced today by blacks, Latinos, Muslims, or other American groups?
Well, Senator, thank you for that question, and thank you also for giving me an opportunity to speak at a little bit of length. I haven't necessarily had much opportunity to respond.
I'm going to have at least one more question for you, so I'll give you a minute or two to respond.
Yes. So thanks to the great work of my friend Harmeet Dillon as the Assistant Attorney General of Civil Rights, I actually think that we've done an incredible job in this administration of getting rid of certain policies that discriminate particularly against white Americans, but also in some cases Asian Americans.
Well, just maybe answer my question. Let's rewind. Because maybe you'll suggest that everything is fine now. Let's rewind a year ago. A year ago, were white Americans the most discriminated against group in the United States? You said it. So
yeah.
Senator,
no, certainly this is my belief. I'm not running away from that. I think that while, of course, all races in different contexts can be subject to really severe discrimination, that when we look at our legal structures, white Americans are often very disfavored in overt ways. We're seeing this in the Small Business Administration, many other places.
So your belief is that white Americans face more discrimination, at least prior to the Trump administration fixing this, than black Americans?
On average, Senator, yes, that's correct, and I'm not running away from that statement at all.
This nomination ultimately did not reach a confirmation vote. On March 12, 2026, the White House withdrew Jeremy Carl's nomination to become Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. The withdrawal came less than a month after this Senate hearing, where his views on race and discrimination became a major focus.
You have made several statements about your worry regarding the erasure of white culture in America. I understand Irish American culture, I understand Italian American culture. I maybe don't understand white culture as well. Tell me the values, the white values that you believed are being erased by the current American government or prior American governments.
Senator, thank you for that question. I would say that it's not, I didn't use the word values, I used the word culture. I think that anytime you have large degrees of mass immigration, you're going to have a change in culture, especially if they're coming from culturally dissimilar backgrounds. And no matter what group it is, if it were in China, it would be the same thing. If it were in New Guinea, it would be the same thing.
Yeah, but tell me about what that means. I mean, culture is values, right? It's expressions of identity. Tell me what is being erased. I mean, give me some examples of what you believe are being erased about white identity. What is white identity to you?
Well, Senator, thank you for that.
Tell me how it's different than other identities.
Senator, I think the question of identity is something that lots of scholars
I guess you can do a sermon on identity, but just tell me how you define white identity and what you think is being erased about white identity.
Senator, thank you again for the question, and genuinely thank you for finally letting me have a chance to explain some of my comments a little bit. But I would say that, they could be things like going to a certain type of Christian church and that sort of culture, which is very different. I mean, you can all be Christians, right, in a certain environment, but African-American Christians might worship differently than Chinese Christians that might worship differently than white Christians. Of course, sometimes you have multi-ethnic churches, but things like that, certain types of Anglo-derived culture that comes from our history.
Like what?
Let me think about this. Senator, I would say if you were to look at the book by one of your former Senate colleagues, Born Fighting, about the sort of Scotch-Irish military culture and certain, pride that went with that, that would be one example. Obviously, you could have sub-elements of that culture. You could have Italians, you could have Irish, and those are in many ways more distinct.
You're worried about white culture. You're not worried about, you're now retreating to ethnic identity. You don't speak about ethnic identity. You speak about white identity. So tell me the values that stitch together white identity and that make it different than black identity.
Senator, again, thank you for the question.
You spent a lot of time talking about this and writing about this.
Yeah, no.
You're struggling with this. But you should be fairly easily, I would assume, able to tell us your thoughts on how white identity is different than other kinds of identity and how it's being erased.
Senator, again, thank you for the question. I'm
You're welcome.
trying to be I'm just trying to be very precise. Because I'm here in front of a Senate committee, I would say that the white church is very different than the black church in terms of its tone and style on average. Food ways could often be different.
And those
music could be different.
And those are being erased.
Music could be different. Well, if you look at the Super Bowl halftime show, which was not in English this year.
So our ability to access white churches or white food or white music is being erased?
Senator, again, thank you for the question. What I would say is the biggest thing, because actually, contrary to many of the comments that have been shown, racial nationalists have been very, very critical of my work because they correctly say that I'm actually, of course, not a racial nationalist, which I'm not. I'm a civic nationalist. I am concerned with the majority common American culture that we had for some time that through particularly mass immigration, I think has become much more balkanized, and I think that weakens us. And again, I'm not running away from that comment. I'm not apologizing for it.
Well, I'm way over my time. I think you're struggling to answer this question, right? Because underlying your beliefs is a sentiment that white culture is just simply better. That white people
Senator, I have to
superior.
disagree with that.
But you haven't been able to really coherently answer any of my questions about how you define white culture, how you define the threat that's posed. I appreciate you being very honest that you believe that white Americans are subject to greater amounts of discrimination in this country than black Americans. I do not think that's a sentiment that is shared broadly on this committee. It is all what makes you just wildly, wildly unqualified to take this post. I'm well over my time. Thank you.
Well, Senator, I do appreciate you letting me actually respond. I genuinely do. So thank you.
The most consequential development after this hearing is that Jeremy Carl's nomination ultimately collapsed. On March 11, 2026, Carl withdrew his nomination to become Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations after failing to secure enough Republican support. Republican Senator John Curtis said he could not support Carl because of his past remarks about Jews, Israel, and other controversial views, while Democrats were uniformly opposed. The White House subsequently transmitted Carl's withdrawal to the Senate. That outcome gives Senator Chris Murphy's questioning much greater significance in retrospect. Murphy was not simply criticizing Carl's ideology during the February hearing. He was testing whether Carl's publicly expressed views about race, immigration, and American identity were compatible with a senior diplomatic position overseeing U.S. engagement with international organizations. The Foreign Relations Committee identified Carl as a nominee who would have led a State Department unit of more than 100 diplomats and dealt with organizations including UNICEF and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. The confrontation centered on one particularly controversial claim. Carl had argued that anti-white discrimination was, on average, more significant than discrimination faced by Black Americans and other groups. Murphy did not allow Carl to retreat into generalities. He asked him directly whether he still believed white Americans were the most discriminated against group in the country. Carl's answer was unequivocal: yes. He said that, on average, white Americans had been particularly disadvantaged by certain government policies and specifically pointed to programs such as those administered by the Small Business Administration. That answer immediately established the central disagreement. Murphy wasn't asking whether discrimination against white Americans can ever occur. Obviously, discrimination can affect people of any racial background. His question was comparative. Does Carl actually believe white Americans experience more discrimination than Black Americans and other minority groups? Carl said he did. That was politically significant because the nominee wasn't merely discussing an abstract academic theory. He was defending a belief that he had previously expressed publicly and that Murphy argued was directly relevant to his fitness for a senior State Department position. The conversation then became much more difficult for Carl when Murphy moved from discrimination to white culture. Murphy pointed to Carl's previous statements expressing concern about the erasure of white culture in America. Rather than accepting the phrase at face value, Murphy asked a very simple question: what exactly is white culture? And more importantly, what specific values does Carl believe are being erased? Carl struggled to provide a concise answer. He initially distinguished culture from values and argued that large-scale immigration from culturally different backgrounds naturally changes a country's culture. He then offered examples such as different forms of Christian worship, Anglo-derived traditions, food and music, and the cultural history of Scotch-Irish Americans. Murphy immediately recognized the problem with that explanation. If examples are Irish culture, Scotch-Irish culture, particular Christian traditions, food, and music, then what exactly makes those things uniquely white rather than ethnic or religious traditions that exist within a much broader American identity? That is why Murphy repeatedly pushed Carl to define the term. The exchange became particularly uncomfortable when Murphy asked Carl to explain what makes white identity different from Black identity. Carl paused and struggled to produce an answer. At one point he said, "Let me think about this." He eventually returned to differences between white and Black churches, foodways, and music before shifting toward a broader argument about a common American culture becoming more balkanized because of mass immigration. That shift is important. Carl appeared to move away from the idea that there is a specific set of universal white values and toward an argument about assimilation and national cohesion. He described himself as a civic nationalist, not a racial nationalist, and argued that mass immigration had weakened what he viewed as a common American culture. That gave his position a different framing. His argument was not explicitly that white people should control the United States. Instead, he was arguing that America historically possessed a dominant cultural framework and that large-scale immigration from culturally different societies could fragment that common identity. Murphy, however, wasn't persuaded. He argued that Carl's difficulty defining white identity exposed a deeper problem with the underlying worldview. Murphy's closing assessment was blunt. Carl appeared unable to coherently explain what white culture was, what was supposedly being erased, or why white identity should be treated as a distinct category. Murphy therefore concluded that Carl's views made him wildly unqualified for the position. But there is an important analytical distinction here. Murphy's criticism was political and normative. Carl's position was partly about immigration, assimilation, and government policy. It is entirely possible to argue that rapid demographic change can alter a country's culture without necessarily believing that one race is inherently superior. Carl himself explicitly rejected the characterization that he was a racial nationalist and said he believed in civic nationalism. So simply labeling his entire argument white supremacy would oversimplify what he actually said during the exchange. At the same time, Murphy identified a legitimate problem. Carl's repeated use of white identity and white culture created a difficult question about exactly what he meant by those categories. If the relevant traditions are Irish, Italian, Scotch-Irish, Christian, Anglo-American, or regional traditions, why describe them collectively as white, rather than identifying them by their actual historical or cultural origins? That was the strongest point in Murphy's questioning. The hearing also mattered because Carl's controversy extended well beyond this particular exchange. Other senators questioned him about past statements concerning Jews, Israel, the Holocaust, and immigration. Republican opposition eventually became decisive. Senator John Curtis publicly said he would not support the nomination, meaning Carl could not rely on Republican unity to overcome Democratic opposition. And that is where the later development changes the meaning of this hearing. Carl ultimately withdrew rather than proceeding to confirmation. So Murphy's statement that Carl was unqualified was not simply the closing line of a heated hearing. The nomination actually failed to advance because Carl could not assemble sufficient Senate support. The broader lesson is about the difference between civic nationalism and racial identity politics. Carl tried to draw that distinction by saying his concern was a shared American culture rather than racial nationalism. Murphy challenged whether Carl's repeated emphasis on white identity could be separated from racial politics when the nominee was unable to clearly define what made that identity distinct. That unresolved tension is what made the exchange so effective on camera. Murphy kept asking a remarkably simple question. What exactly is being erased? Carl had several opportunities to provide a precise answer. Instead, his answers moved through churches, music, food, Anglo-derived traditions, Scotch-Irish military culture, and eventually mass immigration and national cohesion. That allowed Murphy to argue that Carl's concept of white culture was either poorly defined or dependent on ethnic traditions that could be explained without using race as the organizing category. Carl's defense was that he was trying to be precise because he was testifying before the Senate and did not want to misrepresent his views. That is a fair consideration. But from a confirmation hearing perspective, it created another problem. A nominee for a senior diplomatic position needs to be able to explain controversial public positions clearly under scrutiny. And Carl's performance gave his opponents considerable ammunition. The final outcome demonstrated just how damaging that controversy became. After the hearing, Republican Senator John Curtis joined Democratic opposition, and Carl eventually withdrew his nomination in March. So the real significance of Murphy's questioning is not simply that he grilled a nominee over white culture. It exposed a much larger question about what kind of nationalism should guide American foreign policy. Is American identity fundamentally a civic identity open to people from different backgrounds, or should government actively preserve a particular historical cultural majority? Carl argued for a stronger common American culture and assimilation. Murphy saw Carl's emphasis on white identity as evidence of a worldview fundamentally incompatible with the position. And the eventual withdrawal of the nomination shows that this was not merely a rhetorical disagreement inside one Senate hearing. It became a decisive confirmation problem. The debate ultimately wasn't just about whether white culture exists. It was about whether a senior U.S. diplomat should make the preservation of a particular conception of American identity part of the government's foreign policy mission.